I hid my fortune and worked as a waitress in a dingy New York diner, watching billionaires mock me without knowing my secret. The man who humiliated me the most would soon beg for my financial advice. My own family had already thrown me away like yesterday's trash. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 72 years old, I found myself pouring coffee for strangers who looked right through me. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Tony's Diner on East 42nd Street, casting harsh shadows across my weathered hands. The smell of grease and burnt coffee had seeped into my uniform, a pale blue dress that hung loose on my shrinking frame. My orthopedic shoes squeaked against the checkered linoleum as I shuffled between tables, my lower back screaming with each step. Nobody knew that beneath my tired exterior lay a secret worth $47 million. The morning rush was brutal. Wall Street executives barked orders at me like I was invisible, their $1,000 suits a stark contrast to my minimum wage reality. One particular man, Richard Blackstone, came in every Tuesday. He wore Italian leather shoes that cost more than my monthly rent, and his platinum watch caught the light every time he gestured dismissively at me. "Coffee, black, and make it quick, Grandma," he'd say, never looking up from his phone. His voice dripped with the kind of arrogance that only extreme wealth can buy. I'd smile politely, swallow the sting, and pour his coffee with steady hands that betrayed none of my inner turmoil. What he didn't know was that I owned more stock market assets than he'd ever dream of. My Bitcoin investments alone could have bought his penthouse apartment 3 times over. But I was playing a different game, one that required me to remain invisible. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a multimillionaire serving coffee to millionaires who treated me like dirt. But this wasn't about money anymore. This was about surviving the deepest betrayal imaginable, the abandonment by my own children. It started 6 months ago when my daughter Sarah called me from her mansion in the Hamptons. I remember sitting in my cramped studio apartment in Queens, looking out at the fire escape where pigeons had made their nest. The autumn leaves were already falling, creating a carpet of gold and brown on the sidewalk below. "Mom, we need to talk," Sarah had said, her voice cold and businesslike. She'd inherited her father's ruthless streak when it came to money. I had been living quietly in Manhattan for 3 years, ever since my husband Charles passed away. After his funeral, I discovered the extent of our wealth. Investments he'd made decades ago had grown into a vast fortune worth tens of millions. The stock market had been particularly kind to his technology portfolio, and his early investment in cryptocurrency had multiplied beyond our wildest dreams. But revealing this fortune to my family had only brought me pain. My son Michael immediately saw dollar signs. Within weeks of learning about the inheritance, he'd approached me with a business proposal that sounded more like extortion. "Mom, you're sitting on all this money while I'm struggling to keep my restaurant afloat. It's not fair." Sarah was more subtle but equally greedy. She'd suggest expensive family vacations that I would naturally pay for, then exclude me from the actual planning. I'd find myself booking hotels and flights for trips where I felt like an unwanted chaperone rather than the beloved matriarch. The final straw came during what should have been a joyous occasion, my 72nd birthday party. I had rented out a private dining room at an upscale restaurant in Midtown, hoping to gather my family for a celebration. I wore my best dress, a navy blue number with pearl buttons that Charles had loved, and arrived early to make sure everything was perfect. One by one, they made excuses. Michael texted that his restaurant needed him. Sarah called to say her daughter had a soccer game. My youngest, David, simply didn't show up at all. I sat alone at a table set for 8, watching the candles burn down while the waiters cast pitying glances my way. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I would hide my wealth and live as an ordinary person, working a regular job to see how my family really felt about me when they thought I had nothing left to give. The next morning, I walked into Tony's Diner and asked for a job. Tony Martinelli was a 65-year-old Italian immigrant who'd been running the place for 30 years. He looked at me skeptically, taking in my age and physical condition. "Lady, this ain't easy work," he said, wiping his hands on his grease-stained apron. "You gotta be on your feet all day, deal with difficult customers, work weekends and holidays." "I need this job," I told him simply, and something in my voice must have convinced him. Within a week, I had transformed from invisible wealthy widow to invisible working-class waitress. The transition was more jarring than I'd expected. My manicured nails chipped from washing dishes. My carefully styled hair became limp under the diner's humidity. My back ached constantly from carrying heavy trays. But the real pain came from watching how differently people treated me now. When I'd been the wealthy Mrs. Margaret Hamilton, living in my Upper East Side apartment, people were respectful, even deferential. Store clerks smiled. Taxi drivers were polite. My family, while distant, at least maintained the pretense of love. As Margaret the waitress, I became part of the city's invisible underclass. Customers snapped their fingers to get my attention. They complained loudly if their eggs were overcooked, as if their breakfast was more important than my dignity. Businessmen like Richard Blackstone treated me as a fixture, no more worthy of respect than the coffee machine. My family's true colors began to show almost immediately. The first sign came when I called Sarah to tell her I'd taken a job to keep busy. I didn't mention it was waitressing. I let her assume I'd taken some dignified volunteer position at a museum or library. "That's great, Mom," she said, distracted. "Listen, I need to ask you something. Brad's been looking at this new investment opportunity. It's a tech startup that's practically guaranteed to triple our money. We need about $200,000 to get in on the ground floor." My heart sank. Even when she thought I was working to fill empty hours, her first instinct was to ask for money. "I can't help with that right now, sweetheart," I said carefully. The silence on the other end was deafening. When she spoke again, her voice had turned icy. "What do you mean, you can't help? Mom, you have millions just sitting there doing nothing." "I'm trying to be more careful with spending," I explained. "This isn't spending, it's investing." "God, you're so paranoid about money sometimes. Dad would have understood." The conversation ended badly, with Sarah hanging up in frustration. Over the following weeks, her calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Michael's reaction was even worse. When he learned I wouldn't be funding his restaurant expansion, he accused me of being selfish and out of touch. "You're hoarding money like some kind of miser," he shouted during our last phone conversation. "What are you saving it for? You can't take it with you when you die." His cruelty cut deep, especially because there was truth in his accusation. I was hoarding money, but not for the reasons he thought. I was protecting myself from becoming nothing more than a bank account with legs. David, my youngest at 45, simply stopped acknowledging my existence. My calls went straight to voicemail. My texts remained unanswered. It was as if I had died the moment I stopped being useful to him financially. The loneliness was crushing. I'd lie awake in my small Queens apartment, listening to sirens and car horns, feeling the weight of my isolation like a physical thing pressing down on my chest. The apartment itself was a study in careful deception, furnished with second-hand furniture and discount store decorations, designed to look like the home of someone living paycheck to paycheck. My real assets remained safely hidden in offshore accounts and Bitcoin wallets, managed by a discreet financial advisor who thought I was an eccentric rich woman playing some elaborate game. He wasn't entirely wrong. Working at the diner became my refuge from family rejection, even though it brought its own humiliations. My feet swelled in my cheap shoes. My knees ached from standing all day. My hands became rough and calloused from scrubbing dishes and wiping down tables. But there were unexpected moments of grace. Tony's regular customers began to recognize me, some even asking about my day with genuine concern. An elderly man named Frank always left me generous tips and would chat about his grandchildren. A young mother named Rosa would let me hold her baby during slow periods, and I'd remember what it felt like to nurture someone who actually wanted my attention. The other waitresses, mostly women in their 30s and 40s supporting families, treated me with kindness despite our age difference. They covered for me when I moved too slowly, shared their tips when mine were meager, and listened without judgment when I needed to talk. It was Maria, a 40-year-old single mother from the Bronx, who first noticed something was off about my story. "Margaret, honey, you talk different than most of us," she said one afternoon as we cleaned tables after the lunch rush. "You got education, you know about things. Why you working here?" I gave her the story I'd practiced: widow, fixed income, needed to stay busy. But Maria's dark eyes saw right through me. She said, unconvinced. "Well, whatever your story is, you got a good heart. That's what matters." Meanwhile, Richard Blackstone continued his weekly visits, each one a masterclass in casual cruelty. He'd make loud comments about the service when I was within earshot, roll his eyes dramatically if his order took too long, and leave tips so small they felt like insults. "Some people need to learn their place," he'd tell his business associates, clearly intending for me to hear. "Service industry exists to serve. When they forget that, the whole system breaks down." One particularly cold Tuesday morning in February, Richard arrived later than usual, clearly agitated. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his expensive suit looked like it had been slept in. He practically threw himself into his regular booth and started barking orders before I could even approach. "Coffee, now. And I want it hot enough to actually drink, not that lukewarm swill you usually serve." I bit my tongue and poured his coffee, noticing his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the cup. His phone kept buzzing with what sounded like urgent notifications. "Goddamn market," he muttered, not caring that I could hear. 40 years building wealth and it all disappears in 2 weeks. My banker's instincts kicked in. The stock market had been volatile recently, but nothing catastrophic enough to wipe out a truly diversified portfolio. Either Richard was over-leveraged, or he'd made some spectacularly bad investment decisions. Over the following days, his demeanor grew increasingly desperate. He'd sit in that booth for hours, frantically making phone calls and staring at his laptop screen. His expensive clothes began to look worn. His confident swagger became a nervous shuffle. The other customers started to notice. I overheard conversations about Blackstone Industries facing bankruptcy, about SEC investigations, about investors demanding their money back. The man who'd treated me like garbage was losing everything. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt sad. I recognized the look in his eyes, the same desperate fear I'd seen in my own mirror when my family had abandoned me. Money might not buy happiness, but losing it could certainly destroy what happiness you had. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning in March. I was wiping down tables when I heard a commotion from Richard's booth. He was on the phone, his voice rising to near hysteria. "You can't do this to me. I've been with your firm for 15 years. There has to be something, some investment strategy, some way to recover what I've lost." The conversation continued for several minutes, becoming increasingly one-sided as whoever was on the other end apparently hung up on him. Richard stared at his phone in disbelief, then let out a sound that was part sob, part roar of rage. That's when he noticed me watching. "What are you looking at?" he snapped. For 72 years, I'd been trained to apologize, to back down, to make myself smaller. But something had changed in me during these months of exile from family, these months of rediscovering my own strength. "I'm looking at someone who's forgotten that everyone deserves basic respect," I said quietly. He blinked, clearly not expecting a response, let alone that one. "Excuse me? You've been coming here for months, treating me like I'm less than human. Snapping your fingers, making demands, never once saying please or thank you. And now you're sitting here, desperate and broken, and I'm wondering if you've learned anything." Richard's face turned red. "You're lecturing me? You're a waitress. You serve coffee for a living. I've got more money in my wallet than you'll see in a year." I corrected. "You had more money." The words hung in the air between us. Around the diner, conversations had stopped as other customers turned to watch the confrontation. Richard stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup in the process. The hot liquid spread across the table and dripped onto the floor. "Clean that up," he demanded, reverting to his old imperious tone. "That's what you're here for." I looked at the spilled coffee, then back at him. Very slowly, I untied my apron and set it on a clean table. "No," I said. "I don't think I will." And then I did something that shocked everyone in the diner, including myself. I started to laugh. Not a bitter, sarcastic laugh, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of the situation. "You want to know something funny, Richard?" I said, using his name for the first time. 6 months ago, I owned more Bitcoin than you've ever seen. My stock portfolio was worth more than your entire company. I chose to work here, chose to let you treat me badly, because I wanted to see what kind of person you really were when you thought I couldn't fight back." His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That's impossible," he stammered. "You're lying." I pulled out my phone and opened my cryptocurrency wallet app, showing him a balance that made him stumble backward into his booth. Then I showed him my stock portfolio, managed through a discrete investment app that displayed real-time values. $47 million, I said calmly. Give or take a few $100,000, depending on how the market opens today. The diner had gone completely silent. Even Tony had emerged from the kitchen, his mouth agape. Richard stared at the phone screen, his face cycling through disbelief, embarrassment, and something that might have been hope. But why?" he whispered. "Why work here? Why let me?" "Because money doesn't make you a good person," I said. "Character does. And your character, Richard, has been found wanting." I started to walk away, then turned back. But here's the thing about character, it's never too late to change it. That afternoon, I quit my job at the diner. Tony hugged me goodbye, tears in his eyes, and made me promise to keep in touch. Maria and the other waitresses threw me an impromptu farewell party, complete with a cake from the bakery next door. "You gonna be okay?" Maria asked as we cleaned up. "I think so," I told her. Better than okay, actually. But the real test was still ahead of me. It was time to confront my family. I started with a group email to all 3 of my children, asking them to meet me for dinner at a restaurant in Midtown. I chose someplace neutral but nice, not so fancy that it would seem like a bribe, but respectable enough to set a serious tone. Only Sarah showed up. She arrived 20 minutes late, looking harried and checking her phone constantly. Her designer handbag probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her hair was styled in that effortlessly perfect way that actually required hours at an expensive salon. "Sorry I'm late," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "Traffic was murder." Where are Mike and David? They didn't come, I said simply. Sarah ordered a salad and a glass of wine, barely glancing at the menu. I could tell she was already mentally somewhere else, probably calculating how quickly she could get through this dinner and get back to her real life. So what's this about? She asked, stabbing at her lettuce with obvious impatience. I wanted to tell you about my job, I said. Your volunteer work? Mom, that's nice, but I don't really have time for a long dinner. Brad's got this client meeting tonight and I promised I'd be there to charm the wives. It wasn't volunteer work, Sarah. I was a waitress. At a diner in Manhattan. She looked up sharply. What are you talking about? For the past 6 months, I've been working as a waitress, earning minimum wage plus tips, living in a studio apartment in Queens. The color drained from her face. That's impossible. You have millions of dollars. Why would you? Because I wanted to see how my family really felt about me when they thought I had nothing to offer them. Sarah set down her fork, her salad forgotten. For the first time in years, I had her complete attention. Mom, that's crazy. You could have been hurt, or robbed, or ignored, or dismissed, or treated like I was worthless. Which is exactly what happened, from strangers, yes, but more importantly, from my own children. That's not fair, Sarah protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you visited without asking for money? When was the last time you remembered my birthday without Facebook reminding you? Each question hit its mark. Sarah's confident facade began to crumble, revealing something I hadn't seen in years, vulnerability. I've been busy, she said weakly. The kids, Brad's career, my own projects. Your brothers have been busy too. Too busy to return my calls, too busy to visit, too busy to include me in their lives unless they needed something from me. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope, setting it on the table between us. What's that? Sarah asked suspiciously. Documentation of every loan I made to Mike for his restaurants, every investment I funded for David's businesses, every vacation I paid for, every emergency I covered. 23 years of financial support, totaling just over $2 million. Sarah's eyes widened as she looked through the papers. I kept careful records, I continued, because deep down, I knew this day would come. The day when I'd have to decide whether buying your love was worth losing my self-respect. Mom, we do love you, Sarah said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Do you? Or do you love what I can provide? Because there's a difference, sweetheart, and I've spent the last 6 months learning what that difference feels like. Sarah was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe we can't fix it, I said gently. Maybe we can only decide what kind of relationship we want to have going forward. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision I'd been building toward for months. I mean that I'm done being your family's bank account. I'm done being taken for granted. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be because you value me as a person, not as a source of money. But we do value you, Sarah insisted. Then prove it. Call me because you miss me, not because you need something. Visit because you want to spend time together, not because there's some crisis I need to solve. Remember my birthday because you love me, not because you feel obligated. Sarah wiped her eyes with her napkin, smearing her makeup further. For the first time in years, she looked like the little girl I'd raised, vulnerable and uncertain. I don't know if Mike and David will understand, she said. That's their choice to make. But I need you to understand something important, Sarah. I didn't work as a waitress to punish you or to make some dramatic point. I did it to save myself. I was disappearing, becoming nothing more than a checkbook with feelings. That's not love, honey. That's not family. That's just exploitation with prettier words. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 23 years of complicated history settling between us. Finally, Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was tentative, uncertain, but genuine. I want to try, she whispered. I want to have a real relationship with you, not just when I need something. Then we'll try, I said, squeezing her hand. Both of us. Together. Michael never responded to my messages. David blocked my number entirely. But Sarah, slowly and tentatively, began the difficult work of rebuilding our relationship. She started calling just to chat about her day. She brought my granddaughter Lisa to visit, not because she needed a babysitter, but because Lisa had asked to see me. Lisa was 8 years old, with Sarah's stubborn chin and Charles's gentle eyes. She climbed into my lap during that first visit and asked me why I looked so sad. I'm not sad anymore, sweetheart, I told her honestly. I'm just learning how to be happy again. Good, Lisa said matter-of-factly. Grandma should be happy. 3 weeks after my dinner with Sarah, something unexpected happened. Richard Blackstone appeared at my door. I was living in a proper apartment again, not the studio in Queens, but a comfortable two-bedroom on the Upper West Side. I'd decorated it carefully, with artwork I'd collected over the years and furniture that reflected my real personality rather than the charade I'd been living. When I opened the door, Richard looked nothing like the arrogant businessman who'd tormented me at the diner. His expensive suits had been replaced by khakis and a polo shirt. His platinum watch was gone. His perfectly styled hair looked like he'd been running his fingers through it. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said formally. "I hope you don't mind me coming by. I got your address from, well, I hired a private investigator. I know how that sounds, but I need to talk to you." I considered closing the door in his face. After months of his casual cruelty, I owed him nothing. But something in his demeanor stopped me, a humility that seemed genuine. "5 minutes," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He looked around my apartment, taking in the obvious signs of wealth and good taste. A small painting by a minor impressionist hung above my mantelpiece. The furniture was expensive but understated. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase that probably cost more than he'd tipped me in total over all those months. "I've lost everything," he said without preamble. "My company, my house, my reputation. The SEC investigation found irregularities going back years, and they've frozen all my assets. My legal bills alone have bankrupted me." I sat down in my favorite armchair and gestured for him to take the sofa. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you? Really? After how I treated you?" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected him to ask for money or investment advice. I hadn't expected introspection. "Yes," I said honestly. "I wouldn't wish financial ruin on anyone, regardless of how they've behaved." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for a moment looked like a broken man carrying the weight of too many regrets. "I keep thinking about that morning at the diner, when you told me who you really were. I've been replaying every interaction we had, every dismissive comment, every time I treated you like you were beneath my notice." "Why?" I asked. "Because I'm trying to understand how I became that person. I wasn't always like that. When I started my business 30 years ago, I worked alongside janitors and secretaries and treated them like human beings. Success changed me, and not for the better." He looked up, meeting my eyes for what might have been the first time ever. "I need to ask you something, and I know I have no right to ask anything of you after how I behaved. But I'm hoping that maybe you can help me understand how to rebuild. Not my fortune, but my character." The request was so unexpected, so humble, that I found myself reassessing everything I thought I knew about Richard Blackstone. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you're the only person I know who had wealth and chose to give it up to learn something about humanity. Because you worked beside people I would have looked down on and found dignity in honest work. Because you saw through my arrogance to whatever was left of my soul." We talked for 2 hours that afternoon. Richard told me about his childhood in poverty, his desperate climb to wealth, his gradual transformation from ambitious young man to entitled tyrant. I told him about my marriage, my children's betrayal, my months of exile in the working world. By the time he left, we'd laid the groundwork for something I never expected, not friendship exactly, but mutual respect between two people who'd learned hard lessons about what really matters in life. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said as he was leaving, "would it be possible for me to take you to dinner sometime? Nothing fancy, just a chance to treat you with the respect I should have shown all along." "Call me Margaret," I said. And yes, I think I'd like that. 6 months later, I was a different person living a different life. I'd sold some of my cryptocurrency holdings and established a foundation focused on financial literacy for working-class families. The foundation operated out of a small office in Brooklyn, where I spent 3 days a week teaching budget management, investment basics, and retirement planning to people who reminded me of my friends from the diner. Sarah had kept her word about rebuilding our relationship, though it remained fragile and required constant nurturing. We had dinner together every other week, and she'd started bringing Lisa more often. My granddaughter and I had developed a special bond, baking cookies and reading books together without any agenda beyond enjoying each other's company. Michael eventually reached out, not to ask for money but to apologize. His restaurants had failed without my financial backing, and the experience had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his dependence on family wealth. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said during our first conversation in nearly a year. "But I needed you to know that I understand what I put you through." David remained absent from my life, and I'd made peace with that reality. Some relationships can't be salvaged, and that's not always a failure. Sometimes it's just an acknowledgement that people grow in different directions. Richard and I had developed an unlikely friendship built on shared understanding of how money can corrupt and how losing it can sometimes be a gift. He'd found work as a financial advisor for a nonprofit organization, using his experience with both wealth and poverty to help others navigate economic difficulties. "You know what's funny," he said during one of our monthly dinners. I'm happier now than I ever was when I was rich. Are you really? I asked. I think so. I sleep better knowing I'm not hurting anyone. I look at myself in the mirror and like the person looking back. That's worth more than any stock portfolio. I understood exactly what he meant. On a crisp October evening, almost exactly 1 year after I'd started working at Tony's Diner, I found myself back in that neighborhood. Not to visit the diner, Tony had sold it to Maria and her husband, who were turning it into a family restaurant featuring Puerto Rican cuisine, but to attend a community meeting about affordable housing. As I walked past the building that had once housed my refuge from family disappointment, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude for the lessons learned. Sadness for the time lost. Hope for the relationships rebuilt and the new ones discovered. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Grandma, can we make cookies this weekend?" Mom said yes, but only if you want to. The message made me smile. Such a simple request, but it represented everything I'd been fighting for: love without conditions, relationships based on genuine affection rather than financial leverage. I texted back, "Of course, sweetheart. What kind should we make?" Her response came immediately: "Chocolate chip. But also maybe we could try something new." "Always," I replied. "We can always try something new." Walking home through the busy Manhattan streets, I reflected on the strange journey that had led me here. A year ago, I'd been a forgotten widow whose wealth had made her a target for family exploitation. I'd felt invisible, used, and utterly alone despite having more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Now I was still wealthy, but I was also something more valuable. I was free. Free to choose who deserved my time and attention. Free to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Free to use my resources in ways that brought genuine satisfaction rather than obligation. The fortune I'd hidden was still hidden, in a sense. Not from my financial advisors or the IRS, but from the kind of people who saw dollar signs when they looked at me. I'd learned to be selective about revealing my wealth, sharing that information only with people who'd proven they valued me for reasons that had nothing to do with money. My apartment had become a sanctuary filled with meaningful relationships and purposeful activities. Sarah and Lisa were regular visitors, their presence bringing warmth and laughter to rooms that had once echoed with loneliness. Richard's friendship had taught me that people could change, that arrogance could give way to humility, that even the cruelest person might be carrying wounds that explained their behavior without excusing it. The foundation was thriving, helping hundreds of families learn the financial skills that schools had never taught them. Every week, I met people who reminded me of my younger self, hardworking, honest folks who simply needed guidance to make their money work better for them. Their gratitude was genuine and uncomplicated, a stark contrast to the entitled expectations I'd faced from my own children. But perhaps the most important relationship I'd rebuilt was the one with myself. For too many years, I defined my worth through other people's needs and demands. I'd measured my success as a mother by how much I could provide rather than how much wisdom I could share. I'd confused being useful with being loved, and that confusion had nearly destroyed me. Working at the diner had stripped away all the external measures of success and forced me to confront who I was when nobody needed anything from me. In that stripping away, I discovered something I'd forgotten: my own intrinsic value as a human being, independent of my bank account or my willingness to solve other people's problems. The humiliation I'd endured from customers like Richard had been a strange gift, showing me how it felt to be truly invisible in a society that judges worth by external markers. That experience had given me empathy for everyone who serves others while being treated as less than human, the waitresses and janitors and cashiers who keep our world functioning while remaining largely unnoticed and underappreciated. More importantly, it had shown me the difference between respect that was bought and respect that was earned. When Richard finally looked at me with genuine admiration, it wasn't because of my fortune, he'd already lost his own by then. It was because of choices I'd made, risks I'd taken, dignity I'd maintained in the face of his cruelty. That kind of respect was far more valuable than the hollow deference wealth could purchase. As I unlocked my apartment door, I thought about the question that had driven me to such desperate measures a year ago: was I loved for who I was, or for what I could provide? The answer had been painful but necessary. For my children, at least initially, I'd been valued primarily as a resource rather than as a person. But the story didn't end there. Sarah's efforts to rebuild our relationship gave me hope that genuine love could coexist with financial security, that it was possible to be both wealthy and authentically cherished. Lisa's uncomplicated affection proved that the next generation didn't have to repeat the mistakes of the previous one. Richard's transformation reminded me that change was possible at any age, that even the most hardened hearts could soften when faced with their own humanity. My foundation work connected me with countless individuals who appreciated wisdom more than wealth, who valued guidance over gifts. These relationships had taught me that the question wasn't whether to trust people with the knowledge of my fortune, but rather how to build relationships strong enough to withstand that knowledge. Money would always be a complicating factor, but it didn't have to be a corrupting one. Looking around my apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not the restless satisfaction that comes from accumulating more, but the deep peace that comes from knowing you've found your place in the world and the people who belong in it with you. My fortune remained substantial, growing even as I gave portions of it away through the foundation. The stock market continued its eternal dance of gains and losses, but I no longer watched obsessively. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies fluctuated wildly, but their movements no longer dictated my mood. My wealth had become a tool rather than a master, a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The end, I'd learned, was connection. Real, honest, complicated, sometimes difficult connection with other human beings who saw me as a complete person rather than a convenient solution to their problems. That evening, I prepared dinner for myself, not the cheap frozen meals I'd eaten during my diner days, but also not the elaborate restaurant meals I'd used to try to buy my children's time. Instead, I made a simple pasta dish, something that felt nourishing and appropriate for a quiet evening at home. As I ate, I thought about all the people who'd shaped this strange year of my life. Tony, who'd given me a job when I needed to disappear. Maria and the other waitresses, who'd shown me what authentic solidarity looked like. Frank, the elderly regular who'd treated me with kindness when I had nothing to offer in return. Sarah, who'd done the difficult work of examining her own motives and rebuilding our relationship from scratch. Richard, who'd proven that wealth wasn't the only thing that could be lost and recovered. And yes, even Michael and David, whose rejection had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about the dynamics I'd allowed to develop in our family. Their absence from my life was still painful, but it was no longer devastating. I'd learned that I could survive without their approval, and that knowledge had freed me from the desperate need to earn their love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. Lisa and I had plans to experiment with cookie recipes, which might seem trivial to outside observers but felt monumentally important to me. Sarah had mentioned wanting to involve me more in her work with local charities, a sign that she was learning to value my experience and wisdom rather than just my wallet. The foundation was launching a new program to teach financial literacy in high schools, something that might help future generations avoid the mistakes that had led Richard to ruin and my family to dysfunction. But for tonight, it was enough to sit in my comfortable apartment, surrounded by objects that reflected my real personality rather than some performance of wealth or poverty, feeling genuinely at peace with the choices I'd made and the person I'd become. The fortune I'd hidden had taught me that money was neither inherently good nor evil, it was simply a magnifier of character. It could amplify generosity or greed, wisdom or foolishness, love or manipulation. The real treasure I discovered wasn't in my investment accounts or cryptocurrency wallets, but in the relationships I'd built and rebuilt based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I'd spent $47 million worth of lessons learning what I could have discovered for free, that being valued for who you are rather than what you can provide is the greatest wealth of all. The weeks following that reflective October evening brought unexpected developments that would test everything I'd learned about money, family, and the complex relationships between them. The first surprise came in the form of a letter delivered to my apartment by courier on a Tuesday morning. The envelope was thick, expensive, and bore the letterhead of a prestigious law firm in Midtown Manhattan. Inside, I found a document that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. It was a lawsuit, filed by my son David, claiming that I was suffering from dementia and therefore incapable of managing my financial affairs. He was requesting to be appointed as my financial guardian, with full control over my assets. The allegations were breathtakingly creative in their cruelty. According to the filing, my behavior over the past year, quitting my comfortable lifestyle to work as a waitress, living in squalor in Queens, giving away money to strangers through my foundation, constituted clear evidence of cognitive decline and poor judgment. David was asking the court to nullify any financial gifts I'd made in the past year and to freeze my assets until he could assume control. The document even included sworn statements from people I'd never met, claiming to have witnessed my erratic behavior and expressing concern for my well-being. I set the papers down with shaking hands, not from fear but from a rage so pure it surprised me with its intensity. After a year of absence, after blocking my calls and refusing to acknowledge my existence, David had found a way to reduce me to nothing more than an incompetent vessel for money that he felt entitled to control. My phone rang as I was still processing the implications. It was my lawyer, James Morrison, a man I'd worked with for 20 years and whose discretion had helped me maintain my financial privacy. "Margaret, I just received a call about this lawsuit," he said without preamble. "This is serious. Even if the claims are baseless, these cases can tie up assets for months or years while they wind through the courts." "Can he win?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Not if you're competent, which you obviously are." But he doesn't need to win to cause significant damage. The mere existence of the lawsuit will raise questions about your mental state. Some financial institutions might freeze accounts as a precautionary measure. I thought about David as a child, the quiet one who'd always felt overshadowed by his more outgoing siblings. Charles and I had worried about him, wondering if our attention was too focused on Michael's dramatics and Sarah's achievements. We'd tried to give him extra support, extra opportunities to shine. Looking back, I wondered if that extra attention had taught him to see himself as perpetually deserving of more than he'd earned. What do we do? I asked James. We fight it, obviously. I'll need you to undergo psychiatric evaluation to document your competence. We'll also need character witnesses, people who can testify to your mental acuity and sound judgment. The irony wasn't lost on me. To prove I was sane, I'd have to reveal the very experiment that David was claiming proved my insanity. The months I'd spent as a waitress, learning hard truths about my family's love, would have to be explained to strangers who might not understand the reasoning behind such drastic measures. Sarah called later that day, her voice thick with what sounded like genuine distress. Mom, I just heard about David's lawsuit. I can't believe he would do something like this. Can't you? I asked. He hasn't spoken to me in over a year. Why wouldn't he try to get control of my money without having to deal with me personally? I know, but this is so extreme. He's claiming you have dementia, Mom. He's making it public record that he thinks you're incompetent. The pain in her voice made me softer. Sarah might have been guilty of financial opportunism, but she'd never been deliberately cruel the way David was being now. Will you testify on my behalf? I asked her. If this goes to court, I'll need family members who can speak to my mental capacity. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Sarah? Of course I will, she said finally. But Mom, you have to understand how this looks from the outside. You gave up a life of comfort to work in a diner for minimum wage. You lived in a studio apartment when you owned a mansion. Most people would think that's crazy. Most people, I said carefully, wouldn't understand that I was trying to save my relationship with my children. Most people wouldn't understand that being treated like a human ATM was slowly killing me. Another pause. You're right, she whispered. God, Mom, you're absolutely right. I'm so sorry for what we put you through. All of us. The legal battle that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced. David had hired an aggressive attorney who seemed determined to paint me as a wealthy eccentric whose judgment had been compromised by grief and age. They subpoenaed records from Tony's diner, my lease agreement for the Queen's apartment, even my credit card statements showing purchases of discount clothing and cheap furniture. In depositions, David's lawyer asked increasingly invasive questions about my mental state, my motivations, my relationship with my children. Each session was an exercise in having my deepest emotional wounds examined under fluorescent lights by strangers who saw me as nothing more than a legal puzzle to be solved. Mrs. Hamilton, the lawyer said during one particularly brutal session, isn't it true that you've always been controlling when it comes to money? That you used your wealth to manipulate your children's behavior? I looked at him across the conference table, this young man in his expensive suit who probably made more in a year than most families saw in a decade. I used my wealth to help my children when they needed it, I said carefully. When Michael's restaurants were struggling, I provided capital. When Sarah needed funds for her children's education, I wrote checks. When David wanted to start his consulting business, I backed him financially. And when they didn't meet your expectations, you cut them off? When they stopped seeing me as anything more than a source of funding, I tried to change the dynamic. By pretending to be poor? By removing money from the equation long enough to see what remained of our relationships. And what did you find? I looked at David, sitting beside his lawyer, his face a mask of righteous indignation. He'd gained weight since I'd last seen him, and there was something soft and entitled about his appearance that reminded me uncomfortably of myself during my most financially pampered years. I found that some relationships were strong enough to survive without money, I said. And some weren't. The psychiatric evaluation was less humiliating than I'd expected but more invasive than I'd hoped. Dr. Catherine Reeves was a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in competency evaluations for financial disputes. She was thorough, professional, and mercifully free of judgment about my unusual circumstances. Over the course of 3 sessions, she administered cognitive tests, reviewed my medical history, and conducted extensive interviews about my decision-making process over the past year. Mrs. Hamilton, she said during our final session, I need to ask you directly, do you believe your decision to work as a waitress was rational? I considered the question carefully. Rational in the sense that it was based on logical reasoning and clear goals? Yes. Conventional? Absolutely not. Can you explain the logic? I had become estranged from my children, and I suspected it was because they saw me primarily as a source of money rather than as a person worth loving. I removed the financial factor to test that hypothesis. The experiment confirmed my suspicions and ultimately led to meaningful changes in at least one of those relationships. Dr. Reeves nodded, making notes in her file. And you don't see this as an extreme or disproportionate response to family friction? Doctor, have you ever had the experience of wondering whether people love you or just what you can provide for them? She paused, her pen hovering over her notepad. Not to the extent you have, no. Then perhaps you can't fully understand why I felt such drastic measures were necessary. But I can tell you that the alternative, continuing to question the authenticity of every relationship in my life, would have driven me to actual mental illness. Richard proved to be one of my most effective character witnesses. His transformation from cruel customer to thoughtful friend provided compelling evidence that my judgment was not only sound but had led to positive outcomes for others as well. Your Honor, he said during his testimony, Mrs. Hamilton showed extraordinary wisdom in how she handled our interactions. She could have destroyed me professionally when she revealed her true identity. Instead, she chose to offer guidance and support. That's not the behavior of someone with impaired judgment. Maria from the diner also testified, her presence adding authenticity to the proceedings that no amount of expert testimony could match. Margaret, she was one of us, Maria said in her accented English. She worked hard, she treated everyone with respect, she never complained even when customers were mean to her. You want to know if she's crazy? Crazy people don't make friends like she did. Crazy people don't help others like she helped me when my daughter was sick. But perhaps the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Lisa, my 8-year-old granddaughter. The judge had initially been reluctant to allow such young testimony, but Sarah's lawyer argued convincingly that Lisa's perspective on her grandmother's mental state was uniquely valuable. Children, he pointed out, are often the first to notice when beloved adults begin showing signs of cognitive decline. Lisa took the stand wearing her best dress, a navy blue number with white trim that made her look like a miniature version of Sarah at that age. She answered the judge's questions with the kind of straightforward honesty that only children possess. Lisa, the judge said gently, has your grandmother ever acted confused or forgetful when you've been with her? No, sir. Grandma remembers everything. She remembers what cookies I like and what books we've read and even what games I played at school last week. Has she ever said anything that didn't make sense to you? Lisa considered this seriously. Well, grown-ups say lots of things that don't make sense. But Grandma always explains when I ask. Do you think your grandmother is sick? She was sad for a while, but she's not sick. She makes really good cookies and she knows lots of stories and she helps me with my homework. Sick people can't do all those things. David's lawyer tried to shake Lisa's testimony by asking about my living conditions during my time in Queens, but Lisa's responses only strengthened my case. Did your grandmother's apartment seem poor or dirty when you visited? It was smaller than Mommy's house, but it was clean. And Grandma said small apartments are easier to keep tidy, which makes sense. Did your grandmother seem unhappy living there? Lisa thought about this for a long moment. I think she was unhappy about something, but not about the apartment. She seemed happy when we baked cookies and read books. She was just sad about other things. What other things? Sarah's lawyer objected before Lisa could answer, but the damage to David's case was already done. Even an 8-year-old could see that my living situation hadn't been the source of my distress. The trial lasted 3 days. David's team presented a case built on the assumption that wealthy people who choose to live modestly must be mentally impaired. They brought in financial advisors who testified that my investment decisions during my poor period were sound, which actually undermined their argument about my incompetence. My team presented evidence of cognitive testing, character witnesses who testified to my sound judgment, and detailed explanations of my motivations that painted my actions as unusual but rational responses to legitimate concerns about family relationships. The judge, a woman in her 50s who had clearly seen her share of family financial disputes, delivered her verdict with obvious distaste for the proceedings. This court finds no evidence of mental incompetence or inability to manage financial affairs, she said. Mrs. Hamilton's actions over the past year, while unconventional, demonstrate clear reasoning and purposeful strategy. The fact that her methods were unusual does not make them irrational. She looked directly at David before continuing. This court is particularly troubled by the timing and nature of this lawsuit. The plaintiff has had minimal contact with his mother for over a year, yet claims to be acting in her best interest. The evidence suggests that this action is motivated more by financial gain than by genuine concern for Mrs. Hamilton's well-being. David's face flushed red as the judge dismissed the case and awarded attorney's fees to me. As the courtroom emptied, he approached me with what looked like genuine remorse. "Mom," he said quietly, "I never meant for it to go this far." I looked at him for a long moment, this middle-aged man who had once been my baby, the quiet child who'd clung to my leg when Sarah and Michael ran ahead. Yes, you did, I said. You meant for it to go exactly this far. The only thing you didn't expect was to lose. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of the little boy he'd been, confused and hurt and looking for someone to blame for pain he couldn't understand. David, I said more gently, if you ever want to talk about why our relationship fell apart, I'm willing to have that conversation. But not if it's just another strategy to get to my money. He nodded, tears in his eyes, but I could tell he wasn't ready for the kind of honest conversation that might actually heal our relationship. Maybe he never would be. The lawsuit had unexpected consequences beyond its legal resolution. News of the proceedings had leaked to the financial press, and suddenly my story became public in ways I'd never intended. Articles appeared in business magazines about the Waitress heiress and her unusual approach to family relationships. Most of the coverage was sympathetic, focusing on the universal themes of family dysfunction and the corrupting influence of wealth. But some commentators criticized my methods, arguing that I'd manipulated my children just as much as they'd manipulated me. There was truth in that criticism that I had to confront. My experiment with poverty had been, in its own way, another form of control. I'd set up a test that my children were bound to fail, then used their failure to justify cutting them off financially. The difference, I told myself, was that my manipulation was designed to save our relationships, not exploit them. But the line between those motivations was thinner than I'd wanted to admit. The publicity brought unexpected visitors to my door. Adult children of wealthy families reached out to share their own stories of financial dysfunction. Parents who worried about their children's entitlement asked for advice on how to prevent money from corrupting family bonds. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a woman named Catherine whose mother had cut her off financially after Catherine married someone the family disapproved of. I spent 20 years angry at my mother for withdrawing her financial support, Catherine wrote. After reading about your situation, I realized she might have been trying to save our relationship, not punish me. We reconciled before she died, but I wish I'd understood sooner. These stories reminded me that my situation wasn't unique. Across the country, wealthy families were struggling with the same questions about love, money, and authenticity that had driven me to such desperate measures. I decided to write about my experiences, not as a memoir but as a guide for other families navigating the complicated intersection of wealth and relationships. The book would explore the lessons I'd learned about setting boundaries, building genuine connections, and using money as a tool rather than letting it become a weapon. Working on the manuscript became a form of therapy, forcing me to examine my own mistakes alongside my children's. I wrote about the ways I'd enabled their dependence on my money, how I'd confused generosity with love, how my own need to feel needed had contributed to our dysfunctional dynamic. Sarah read early drafts and provided feedback that was both painful and useful. "Mom, you write about us like we were these calculating monsters who never really loved you," she said during one of our dinners. "But that's not how it felt from our side. We thought you wanted to help us. We thought that's how families worked." She was right, of course. I'd raised them in a world where money flowed freely from my accounts to theirs, where financial support was the primary way I expressed love and concern. It wasn't surprising that they'd internalized those patterns and struggled when I suddenly changed the rules. The book became more balanced as I incorporated these insights, focusing less on my children's failures and more on the systemic patterns that wealthy families can fall into without realizing it. Publisher interest was strong, perhaps because my story had already gained media attention. But I chose a smaller, more literary publisher that understood I wasn't trying to write a sensational tell-all but rather a thoughtful exploration of a universal problem. The advance was modest by my standards but symbolically important. For the first time in my adult life, I was earning money through my own work rather than through investments or inheritance. The feeling was surprisingly satisfying. Richard read the manuscript and provided insights from his own experience of losing and rebuilding wealth. His perspective added depth to my understanding of how money changes people and how those changes can be reversed. "You know what I learned from going broke," he said during one of our editing sessions. "It wasn't that money is evil or that poor people are more virtuous. It's that money amplifies whatever you already are. If you're generous, wealth makes you more generous. If you're selfish, wealth makes you more selfish." This insight became a central theme of the book, money as an amplifier rather than a creator of character. The foundation work continued to provide both purpose and perspective. Every week, I met families struggling with basic financial literacy, people for whom my problems with excessive wealth must have seemed absurd. Yet many of them understood the core issues better than the financial advisors who managed my investments. "Mrs. Hamilton," said one workshop participant, a single mother working 2 jobs to support her children, "what you're describing isn't really about money. It's about respect. You wanted your family to respect you as a person, not just as a provider." She was absolutely right, and her insight helped me understand why the foundation work felt so meaningful. These families respected my knowledge and experience because I'd earned their respect through useful service, not because of my net worth. As the first anniversary of my revelation to Richard at the diner approached, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed and how much had remained the same. My relationships with Sarah and Lisa continued to deepen, built now on genuine affection rather than financial obligation. Michael had reached out several times since the lawsuit, making tentative overtures toward reconciliation. We'd had coffee twice, awkward conversations where we both tried to navigate the wreckage of our relationship without either of us quite ready to take full responsibility for the damage. David remained absent, his defeat in court having apparently convinced him that any relationship with me would come without the financial benefits he'd hoped to secure. Richard had become one of my closest friends, our shared experience of financial loss and recovery creating a bond that might have seemed unlikely to outside observers. We met weekly for dinner at modest restaurants, often joined by other people we'd met through foundation work or community activities. The book was nearing completion, its message clearer now than when I'd started. Wealthy families could maintain authentic relationships, but only through conscious effort and clear boundaries about the role money would play in their interactions. My apartment had become a gathering place for this new community I'd built around shared values rather than shared wealth. Sarah and Lisa came for weekly dinners. Richard brought friends from his nonprofit work. Foundation participants would stop by occasionally, usually to share success stories about financial goals they'd achieved. These gatherings reminded me of dinner parties from my married life, but with a crucial difference. The conversation was more honest, the connections more genuine, the laughter more spontaneous. People came because they wanted to be there, not because they felt obligated or because they hoped to gain something from attending. On the exact anniversary of my confrontation with Richard at the diner, I threw a small party to celebrate not my revelation but what it had led to. The guest list included everyone who'd been part of my journey back to authentic relationships: Sarah and Lisa, Richard, Maria and her family, Dr. Reeves, even James, my lawyer who'd become more friend than advisor over the past year. As I looked around my living room at this unlikely collection of people, I realized I'd finally answered the question that had driven me to such desperate measures. I was loved for who I was, not what I could provide. The proof was sitting in front of me, people who continued to choose my company even when they gained nothing material from the association. The fortune I'd hidden was still there, still growing through careful investments and conservative management. But it no longer defined me or dictated how people treated me. I'd learned to be selective about revealing my wealth, sharing that information only after relationships had already been established on other grounds. Lisa, now 9 years old and even more confident than before, stood up during dinner to make a toast with her glass of sparkling apple cider. "I want to toast Grandma," she announced seriously, "for teaching us that being rich isn't about having money. It's about having people who love you for real reasons." The adults looked at each other in amazement. This child had grasped what it had taken me 73 years to understand. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah lingered behind to help clean up. "Mom," she said as we loaded the dishwasher, "I have something to tell you. Brad and I have been talking about your book, about the patterns you write about. We've decided to put most of the kids' college funds into trusts they can't access until they're older. We want them to feel like they have to earn their way in the world." I hugged her tightly, proud of the woman she was becoming and grateful that at least one of my children had learned from our family's mistakes. "That's a good choice," I told her. "But remember, the goal isn't to make their lives harder. It's to make their relationships more honest." "I know," she said. "I think I finally understand the difference." Later that night, alone in my apartment, I sat in my favorite chair and reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. The fortune I'd hidden had taught me invaluable lessons about human nature, family dynamics, and the true meaning of wealth. But perhaps most importantly, it had taught me about resilience. At 72, when many people assume their personalities are fixed and their relationships cannot change, I discovered that transformation was still possible. I'd learned to demand respect, to set boundaries, to build new connections based on mutual regard rather than mutual benefit. The money in my accounts hadn't changed; if anything, careful management had increased it. But my relationship to that money had transformed completely. It was no longer my identity or my primary tool for relating to others. It had become what it should have been all along, a resource to be used thoughtfully in service of values and goals that transcended material accumulation. My phone buzzed with a late-night text from Richard: "Thank you for tonight." It reminded me what family is supposed to feel like. I smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. We'd both learned that family isn't always determined by blood or legal adoption. Sometimes it's chosen by people who decide to show up for each other consistently, in ways that have nothing to do with financial obligation. The fortune I'd hidden had revealed truths I never could have discovered through direct confrontation or family therapy. Sometimes the most indirect path leads to the most direct insights about what really matters in life. As I prepared for bed, I thought about tomorrow's activities. Foundation workshops in the morning, lunch with a potential book publisher, dinner with Sarah and Lisa. A life full of purpose, connection, and meaning, luxuries that no amount of money can truly buy, but that become possible when money stops being the primary measure of worth. The greatest fortune I discovered wasn't in my investment portfolio or cryptocurrency wallet. It was in the knowledge that I could be valued simply for being myself, that relationships could exist without financial ulterior motives, and that it was never too late to insist on authentic love over convenient exploitation. That realization, hard-won through months of minimum wage labor and family rejection, was worth more than $47 million. It was worth everything. Have you ever felt invisible to the people who should love you most? Have you ever wondered whether your family sees you as a person or just as a solution to their problems? If my story has touched something in your heart, please take a moment to share it in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply acknowledge that we're not alone in our struggles. And if this helped you today, please like this video and subscribe. Together, we can make sure these important conversations reach others who need to hear them. Remember, your worth isn't measured by what you can give to others, but by the unique person you are. You have the right to be loved for yourself, not for your utility. And it's never too late to demand that respect, even if it means walking away from relationships that drain rather than nourish your soul. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing me. And thank you for reminding me that true connection is the greatest fortune of all.